It was a quiet Wednesday night, or at least, that's how it was supposed to be. I had worked late at the office, just finishing up some projects when I decided to head home, eager to unwind and relax with my wife, Sarah. I had no idea that night would change my life forever. I entered the house and heard the low hum of the TV in the living room, the faint rustle of the curtains from the slight breeze coming in. But something felt off. There was a strange tension in the air. I didn't know exactly what it was, but my instincts were screaming at me. As I moved through the house, I could hear muffled sounds coming from the bedroom. Curiosity tugged at me, and without a second thought, I pushed open the door. What I saw in that moment, frozen in time, will forever be etched in my mind. Sarah, my wife, the woman I had trusted with everything, was on top of another man. Her back arched, her body moving in ways I had never seen before. She didn't hear me. She didn't know I was there. And then, the man, the bastard who had taken what was mine, looked up. His eyes locked with mine, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Goodnight, Cuckold," he sneered, the words sharp like daggers. He didn't even seem fazed by the fact that I was standing there, watching the scene unfold. Before I could say anything, before I could process what was happening, he swung a bat in my direction with all the force he could muster. It cracked against my skull, and I stumbled back, but it wasn't enough to take me down. I had fought in my younger years, boxing, mixed martial arts, whatever I could to stay in shape, and that training kicked in. I wasn't just going to be a victim. I wasn't going to let him take everything I had worked for. The world spun for a second as I regained my balance, my adrenaline pumping, but my mind was focused. I wasn't going to let this bastard win. Not today. I rushed forward and knocked the bat from his hand. His face twisted with rage, but it didn't matter. I was faster. I tackled him to the ground, my fists landing in a flurry of punches. The bastard had no chance against me. And yet, as I punched him, my mind was elsewhere, on her, Sarah. The woman I had loved. The woman I had trusted. How could she betray me like this? Finally, I took a deep breath and stood up, looking down at the mess I had made of him. His arm was clearly broken, but he didn't care. All he did was laugh. "She'll never go back to you, man. She's mine now." The words stung. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was knowing she didn't care about me. She was still on the bed, not even bothering to get up, just staring at me with that cold, indifferent look. "You're pathetic," Sarah said with a sneer. "You should have known better. I've wanted this for months. And you, well, you were just too much of a loser to notice." Her words cut deep. No empathy. No regret. Just cold, calculated cruelty. I looked down at the guy I had just beaten. I knew I could do more, but part of me wanted to just walk out. I wanted to leave, to walk away and never look back, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to know why. "You really think it's over, don't you?" Sarah mocked. Her voice was calm, like she was talking to a child, like I was the joke in all of this. "I was done with you the moment I met him, Jack," she continued, her words making me feel smaller than I ever had in my life. "You just didn't get it. You were too boring. Too predictable. Too nice." Those words hurt more than any punch or insult ever could. She had used me. She had used me until she couldn't get anything more from me. Her betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional. Every moment we had spent together, every promise we had made, it meant nothing to her. And the man who had taken my place in her life just grinned, his broken arm hanging limply by his side. "You're weak, dude." She wanted someone who could give her what you couldn't. I didn't know what was worse, the physical pain or the crushing weight of emotional devastation. How could I have been so blind? How had I missed all the signs? But it didn't matter now. All that mattered was the reality that I wasn't enough for her. I wasn't enough for Sarah. I stood there, staring at her with nothing but disbelief, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. How was I supposed to react to this? What was I supposed to do? I could feel the weight of her words sinking in, like heavy chains pulling me deeper into a pit. You were never enough, she repeated, almost matter-of-factly, as if this was some kind of business transaction. There was no remorse in her eyes, only indifference, like I was some obsolete thing she had grown tired of. The man, my wife's lover, the one who thought he could get away with it, was still laying there, holding his broken arm, wincing every few seconds. His smirk hadn't faded, but there was something in his eyes now. Fear. Realization. He was beginning to understand that I wasn't the same man I had been just moments before. The sting of betrayal burned hotter than the throbbing pain in my skull. She hadn't even looked at me since I stepped into that room. No, she was too busy with her new life, with her new choices. What did I ever mean to her? Was it all just a lie? You really are pathetic, you know that, she said, her voice cool, unbothered. This is what happens when you're too busy being a good guy. The irony of it made my blood boil. She was the one who had promised me love, loyalty, and respect. She had taken that sacred trust and shredded it like it meant nothing. And I? I was the one who had been too good to see it. Too good to believe that the woman I married, the woman I had fought for, would ever betray me like this. But here we were. I could feel my pulse racing. My fists clenched at my sides, but I held myself back. What good would violence do now? The physical confrontation had been necessary. He had tried to strike me with that bat, and I had defended myself, but this wasn't about physical strength. It was about what she had done to me. The emotional brutality. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe through the anger. She wasn't worth breaking any more of his bones. She wasn't even worth getting angry about anymore. The damage was done. You really want to go down this path, Sarah? My voice was steady, but it felt like my whole world was collapsing around me. I had to hold on, if only just for a moment longer. You're willing to throw away everything we've built, everything we've been through, for a cheap thrill? She stared at me, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't at all loving or reassuring. Oh, please. You're so naive. You always were. I wanted someone who knew how to take charge, someone who could give me what I needed. Needed? I laughed bitterly. What's that supposed to mean? Was I not enough in bed? Or was it just that I wasn't exciting enough for you anymore? Her eyes flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. You were fine, Jack. You were just too much of a predictable little puppy. You gave me the house, the dinners, the holidays, everything I needed in the perfect little package. But when it came to what I wanted, you were a disappointment. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Every word was like a punch, each one more brutal than the last. She had taken our life and torn it apart piece by piece, and I had no idea when it had started, if it had ever been real at all. I looked at the man again, the one who was still grimacing on the floor. His smug expression faded just a little bit when he saw the way I was handling it. He had expected me to lose it. Expected me to get angry. He hadn't expected the calm. He hadn't expected me to look at the wreckage of my marriage with such clarity. You think this is it? You think you've won? I asked Sarah, my voice quiet now, the emotion behind it more dangerous than any shout could have been. Do you even realize what you've done? How much this will cost you? It's not just about me anymore. It's about everything we've built together. Her eyes flickered, and for a split second, I saw something I hadn't expected, regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She stood up from the bed, brushing herself off like I wasn't even there. Like I had no right to feel hurt. Don't you get it? She snapped, walking toward me with that cold, smug attitude. I don't care about you. I never did. I care about what I can get from people. And you? You were just a stepping stone. A means to an end. Now I have him. She pointed at the man, who finally managed to push himself up, cradling his arm, a slight grimace on his face. He stepped forward, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held over me, the victory he thought was his. You're worthless, he said, his words dripping with disdain. She's mine now, and you? You're just a joke. The anger that had been building up inside me reached its peak. But something shifted in me. Something I hadn't realized I was capable of. I didn't scream. I didn't lose control. Instead, I stepped back, gave one last glance at the mess of a life I'd been living, and made a decision. You've both already lost, I said, my voice now steely and calm. This is over. You think you've won? You haven't. Not by a long shot. I turned around, walked out of that bedroom, and slammed the door behind me. It wasn't worth it. She wasn't worth it anymore. And as for him, he was a fool to think he had anything over me. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let her destroy me. Not today. Not ever. This was just the beginning of a new chapter. And it would be a chapter where I didn't have to carry the weight of someone else's betrayal on my shoulders anymore. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I left behind more than just a marriage. I left behind the man I used to be, the man she thought she could manipulate. And in his place, I would build someone stronger. Someone who would never let anyone do this to him again. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find peace. I didn't look back as I walked out of that door. The weight in my chest wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the crushing weight of betrayal anymore, it was something else. Something raw, something terrifying, but something that also tasted like freedom. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped into the driveway, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of it all. What had just happened? What had she done to me? What had I just done? The questions kept circling, but I didn't have any answers. All I had was the taste of the bitterness in my mouth, the sting of her words, and the sound of that bat hitting my skull ringing in my ears. I knew I needed to keep moving. I needed to get away from the house, away from the life I had been living. But where? Where did I go now that everything was shattered? I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't go back in there. Not after everything that had just happened. I threw myself into my car, started the engine, and just drove. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere. Somewhere that didn't smell like betrayal, somewhere that didn't echo with her laughter and his smug face. Somewhere where I could just breathe for a moment. The road stretched out in front of me, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't even realize how far I'd gone until I saw the neon sign of a 24-hour diner on the side of the road. It wasn't much, but it felt like a sanctuary. Somewhere to stop, to gather myself, to figure out what the hell was happening. I parked the car and walked in, the bell above the door jingling as I pushed it open. The smell of greasy food and stale coffee filled the air, and for a moment, it felt normal. A waitress, middle-aged with a name tag that read, Kathy, smiled at me from behind the counter. She looked me over for a second, probably wondering why a guy like me was showing up at this hour looking like I'd just stepped out of a war zone. Hey there, she said, her voice soft but with a warmth I wasn't used to. You want a seat? I nodded, not trusting my voice to answer any questions. She led me to a booth in the back, and I slid into the seat, staring out the window at nothing in particular. My thoughts were a blur. How could Sarah do this to me? How could I have missed it? How did everything slip through my fingers without me realizing? The waitress placed a cup of coffee in front of me, and for a second, I wondered if she could sense that I wasn't okay. Maybe she had seen enough broken people walk in those doors to know exactly what was going on. I took a sip, the hot liquid burning my throat, but it didn't seem to matter. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. I just needed time to think. Time to figure out what my next move would be. I spent what felt like hours in that diner, just staring out the window, trying to put the pieces together. The betrayal. The fight. The words she said. And the man, the scumbag who thought he could take what was mine without any consequences. I wasn't going to let it slide. I wasn't going to let her win. She had chosen this path, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't going to rush into anything. I wasn't going to make any more rash decisions. No, I needed time. I needed to let the shock wear off. I needed to let the anger cool before I made any decisions. As the minutes turned into hours, I finally made up my mind. I wasn't going back. I couldn't go back to her. There was no going back after something like this. I was done. The thought hit me like a ton of bricks, but for the first time that night, I felt a sense of clarity. The fog was lifting, and I could finally see the truth. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, had shown me who she truly was. She wasn't the person I thought she was. She wasn't the person I had married. She was a stranger. A cold, heartless stranger who didn't care about me, didn't care about our life together. It was time to move on. I left the diner just as the sun began to rise, the first light of the morning creeping into the sky. The world outside looked different, and maybe that was exactly what I needed, a new perspective. I got back into my car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, but I was sure of one thing: I was never going back to that house. I was never going back to her. As I drove, I realized that the road ahead was wide open. I could go anywhere. I could start over. The only thing that held me back was the pain. The pain of what had happened, the pain of being deceived by the person I thought would always have my back. The pain of knowing that my trust had been shattered. But even that pain couldn't hold me down forever. Eventually, it would fade. And as for her? As for Sarah? She would have to deal with the mess she had created. But I wasn't going to be a part of it anymore. I drove on, the sound of the engine humming beneath me, the open road stretching out ahead. The past was behind me. The future? It was all mine. The road stretched out in front of me, a ribbon of black under the soft glow of the morning sky. The further I drove, the more I felt the weight lifting off my chest, the tightness in my gut slowly unraveling. It was like every mile that passed was one more step away from the nightmare I'd just left behind. The anger that had threatened to consume me was fading, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite name yet. But whatever it was, it felt like freedom. I hadn't planned to go this far. I didn't know where I was headed, but I didn't care. The world felt too small now, too confining. It felt like everything I knew had been a lie, and the only thing I could do was run, even if I had nowhere to run to. Hours passed, the landscape shifting from city lights to dark rural roads, until I finally found myself in a small town. The kind of place where people don't ask questions. The kind of place where you can blend in and disappear. I parked my car in front of a small motel, the sign flickering above me. Vacancy, in glowing red letters. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. Was this really how I was going to deal with everything? Was I going to just disappear into the night and forget all of it? I slammed the car door and walked into the office. The woman behind the counter barely glanced at me as I paid for a room. She gave me a key, a knowing smile, and then went back to her crossword puzzle. She didn't care about my story. She didn't care about anything. And for the first time in days, I realized I didn't need anyone to care. I needed space. I needed time. I shut the door behind me and locked it, the silence in the room pressing in on me. There was no escaping it now. The reality of what had happened was sinking in, and with it came an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel hate. I just felt empty. What was I supposed to do with all of this? What was the point of all those years with Sarah, all those promises? I had given her everything, and this was what I got in return. She had thrown it all away for a cheap thrill. For him. I sat down on the bed, my head spinning. My mind kept replaying the image of her, of him. The way she looked at me with that cold, disinterested stare. The way she didn't even try to hide the contempt in her voice. I had been nothing to her. Nothing more than a stepping stone. And that hurt more than anything. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that I had wasted so much of myself on someone who never cared. But I couldn't stay in this headspace. I couldn't let it drown me. I stood up, walked over to the small, cheap motel bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. The reflection in the mirror wasn't the same as it had been before. I didn't recognize this guy looking back at me. Who was I now? Was I just some fool who let himself get used? Was that all I was? I had always prided myself on being strong, on being the guy who could handle anything life threw at him. But this was different. This was something that cut deeper than I had ever imagined. I ran a hand through my hair, staring at my reflection. It wasn't the first time I had looked at myself this way. I had done it plenty of times before, after a bad breakup, after a failure at work, after a fight with a friend. But this was different. I wasn't just a guy who was down on his luck. I was a guy who had been blindsided by the person he loved. And that was something I didn't know how to handle. The truth was, I had spent so many years building my life around her, around the idea of us, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had let her define me. Let her shape the person I had become. But not anymore. I wasn't going to be that man anymore. I grabbed my keys, left the motel room, and walked outside, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear, I couldn't stay in that place anymore. I had to move on. And somehow, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be some smooth, straight line where I just walked away and never looked back. No, this was going to be a journey. A long one. But as I drove away from that town, I realized something. I wasn't as lost as I thought I was. I wasn't just some broken man. I was someone who had survived this. And if I could survive this, I could survive anything. I wasn't done yet. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important realization of all. The road ahead was still unknown. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face it. Ready to rebuild. Ready to start fresh. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready for whatever came next. And if Sarah thought she had taken everything from me, well, she was wrong. Because the one thing she couldn't take away from me? My future. My freedom. I didn't need her. I never had. And as the miles stretched out in front of me, I knew that I was finally, truly, free. The road ahead of me blurred as the miles clicked by, one after another, stretching into infinity. My hands gripped the wheel, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I couldn't let go of the image of her, the way she had looked at me with cold detachment. It was a look that had shattered me, but somehow, I was still breathing. I hadn't let myself think about what I was running from, or what I was running to. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was moving. Moving away from the life I thought I had. Moving away from her. But I wasn't running away from the truth. No. The truth was simple, Sarah had chosen him. And in doing so, she had chosen a life without me. The road twisted and turned, and I barely noticed the scenery anymore. I couldn't focus on anything except the gnawing emptiness inside of me. The life I had built with Sarah, it was gone. And in its place? Just echoes. Just questions. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been. The anger was fading, like smoke disappearing into the wind. What was the point? What was the point of holding on to that kind of rage when the only thing left to do was move forward? And yet, even in the absence of anger, something darker began to surface. A cold, empty void that felt like it could swallow me whole. What had I done wrong? Was it my fault? Was I the one who had missed all the signs, too wrapped up in the life I thought I had? I couldn't tell anymore. The more I thought about it, the more questions piled on top of each other. And the deeper I fell into that pit, the more I realized I wasn't going to find any answers. The only thing that remained was the harsh reality. Sarah had made her choice. And now, I had to make mine. I didn't know how long I had been driving, but eventually, I found myself in another small town. A place that felt like it was trapped in time, an old diner on the corner, a gas station with peeling paint, and streets that seemed to go nowhere. I parked the car at the edge of the lot and got out. The world felt quiet here. Still. As if time itself had slowed down, as if it was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to keep moving. I walked into the diner without thinking. The bell jingled above the door as I stepped inside, the faint smell of burnt coffee and greasy food in the air. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a name tag that read Joanne, looked at me like I was just another customer, which, in a way, I was. But to me, it felt like everything was different. "Morning," she said, her voice neutral. "What can I get you?" I sat at the counter, my eyes wandering over the menu without actually reading it. What was I supposed to order? What did I even want anymore? "Coffee," I said finally, my voice rough. I didn't realize how thirsty I was until I heard myself speak. "Coming right up," Joanne replied, turning to grab the pot. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversations, the sizzle of the grill in the back, everything felt so ordinary. Like none of this was real. Like none of this was happening. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself in the present. I was here now. In this moment. I had left everything behind. Sarah, the house, the life I thought I had, it was all gone. A man in his late 30s sat 2 stools down from me, glancing at me briefly before looking back down at his plate. He wasn't anything special, just a regular guy, maybe a little older than me, wearing a plaid shirt and worn jeans. But there was something about him. A sense of familiarity in the way he carried himself. Maybe it was because I was seeing him through my own eyes, reflecting back at me. Joanne placed the coffee in front of me, and I wrapped my hands around the mug, the heat of it grounding me in the present moment. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her voice softer this time, like she knew something wasn't quite right. I met her eyes, and for a moment, I almost told her everything. I almost told her about Sarah, about the affair, about the fight. But I didn't. I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steady, even though nothing felt fine. "Just needed to get away." She nodded, like she understood. Maybe she did. People didn't live in small towns like this without seeing the kind of hurt I was carrying. They'd seen it all before. I sipped the coffee, and the warmth settled in my chest. But it didn't fix anything. Nothing could. The man next to me cleared his throat, and I turned to look at him. He was looking at me now, his eyes curious but kind. "You look like you've been through hell," he said. "Been there. Been through it myself." Something in the way he said it made me pause. This wasn't just some random guy making small talk. He was saying it like he knew. "Yeah, well," I started, unsure of what I was even going to say. I'm not sure I've seen the worst of it yet. His lips quirked up slightly, a knowing smile. Oh, you will. It gets worse before it gets better. But don't let it eat you alive, man. Don't let it ruin you. The weight of his words landed on me like a heavy stone. The thing I had been running from, this pain, this betrayal, he was right. It wasn't going to go away on its own. It wasn't something you could outrun. You learn to live with it, he continued, sipping his own coffee. It's not about forgetting. It's about moving forward. I let that sink in, letting the weight of his words seep into my soul. Moving forward. That was the only choice I had left. Moving forward. I stood up, left a few dollars on the counter, and walked out of the diner without saying another word. The air outside was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my breath visible in the air. It wasn't going to be easy. But nothing worth doing ever was. As I drove away from that small town, the road ahead seemed a little clearer. The pain was still there, still raw, still jagged. But there was a sense of resolve in me now. I wasn't going to let it consume me. I was going to keep going. Keep moving. Because the one thing Sarah hadn't taken from me? My future. And I wasn't going to let her take that, too. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the air as I drove, my hands still clutching the wheel with an almost desperate grip. I couldn't remember when I had left the diner, couldn't recall the exact moment when my mind had shifted, but it had. Something inside of me had snapped into place. The man at the counter had been right. I had been running from the pain, but now, I wasn't sure what I was running toward. I had no direction. No plan. I could barely even see the road ahead, my thoughts clouded with every turn I made. Yet, there was something oddly liberating about it. The weight that had been on my chest, the suffocating need to know why she did it, why Sarah had betrayed me, was starting to lift. I didn't have answers, and I might never have them, but maybe that was okay. Maybe not knowing was the first step toward finally healing. I didn't realize it at first, but my foot had been pressing harder on the gas pedal. I was speeding, faster and faster, trying to outrun the demons that still haunted me. Trying to outdrive the thoughts of her with him, the way she looked at me like I was nothing but an obstacle. My pulse quickened with every mile, as if I could escape the memories altogether. But then, in the blink of an eye, the world seemed to slow down. A flicker of light caught my attention. It was a flash, almost imperceptible, coming from the side of the road. Without thinking, I swerved. The screech of tires, the jerk of the wheel, it all happened in an instant. My heart was in my throat, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The car veered off course, and the sound of the gravel crunching beneath the tires filled my ears. I slammed the brakes, but it wasn't enough. The car slid to a stop, the tires losing grip on the dirt and leaving us stranded on the side of the road. I sat there, my breathing heavy, my chest tight, the reality of the near miss sinking in. I had almost crashed. Almost lost control completely. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, staring out the windshield at the stretch of road in front of me. The silence in the car was deafening, and the adrenaline of the near crash was still pulsing through my veins. It had taken this moment, this sudden, shocking jolt, to force me to stop. To pause. To face what I had been trying to outrun. I turned off the engine and sat there for a long time, staring at the road, at the headlights casting long shadows in front of me. What was I doing? What was I supposed to do now? It felt like I had been in a blur for days, weeks even, just chasing after something that wasn't there. Running from a life that had crumbled beneath me. But I was tired now. I was exhausted. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The road wasn't going to change. The world wasn't going to wait for me to catch up. And Sarah? She wasn't going to change either. I couldn't go back to her. The thought of it, the thought of going back into that house, pretending like everything was okay, made me feel sick to my stomach. The way she had looked at me with that cold detachment. The lies. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. But, where did that leave me? I didn't have answers, but I had a decision. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew what I had to do. I climbed out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. I looked at the sky, the faintest hints of daylight beginning to break through the dark. It wasn't the clearest of mornings, but it was a start. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, lost in my own thoughts, but eventually, I made my way back to the car. The decision was made. I wasn't going to go back to her. I wasn't going to let the past dictate my future. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew that the road ahead would be mine to navigate. I had no destination, no set path, but I had something even more important, freedom. It felt strange, almost alien, to be without the weight of Sarah hanging over me, to not have her, to not have the life we built together. But in that strange emptiness, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I had never been the kind of person to just let life happen to me. I had always been the one to make decisions, to act, to take control. And now it was time to do that again. It was time to take back the reins. To rebuild. There was a long road ahead. A long, unpredictable journey. But I wasn't alone in it. I had myself. And that had to be enough. As I pulled the car back onto the road, I felt something inside of me shift. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was something more subtle. Something like the first steps toward healing. I wasn't sure where I would end up, but I knew that no matter how far I drove, no matter how many twists and turns lay ahead, I was going to be okay. Maybe even more than okay. For the first time in a long time, I had hope. And that was all I needed. With that thought, I pressed down on the gas pedal and headed into the unknown. The future was waiting, and I was ready for it. The car moved steadily down the road, the gentle hum of the tires almost lulling me into a trance. The horizon stretched wide and endless, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I allowed myself to breathe. I wasn't running anymore. Not from Sarah, not from the pain. I had stopped trying to outrun it and had started accepting it as part of me. The morning sunlight spilled across the road ahead, casting long, soft shadows. I let the warmth wash over me, the stillness of the moment settling in like an old friend. I wasn't looking for answers, and I wasn't searching for closure. I had made my choice, I was moving forward, with or without the understanding of why things had turned out the way they did. Still, a part of me longed for some kind of explanation. I couldn't lie about that. The thought of Sarah and him, of what she had done, stirred something in my chest. But the ache, the rawness that had once felt suffocating, had softened. The silence in my car felt different now. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt open. I needed to keep going. As I drove, my mind wandered. The first time I had met Sarah, I had thought she was everything I'd ever wanted. She was beautiful in a way that made your heart stop. Confident. Intelligent. It was easy to fall in love with her, easy to believe she was perfect. Maybe, in the beginning, I thought I was perfect for her too. But somewhere along the way, I had lost track of who I was. I had been so consumed with trying to keep our world intact, so eager to please her, to keep her happy. Maybe I had forgotten to focus on what made me happy. Maybe I had forgotten that I wasn't just a supporting character in her life. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had given away until it was too late. I gripped the wheel a little tighter, my chest tightening. The guilt was still there, lingering at the edge of my thoughts. But I wasn't going to let it drown me anymore. I wasn't going to apologize for her actions. I wasn't going to carry her betrayal like a stone around my neck. I looked around, taking in the unfamiliar landscape. A small town passed by on my right, familiar in its simplicity. There was a kind of charm in these places. They felt untouched by the chaos of big cities. Peaceful. Maybe that's what I needed. Maybe I needed to find somewhere like this, somewhere I could breathe without feeling the weight of the past crushing me. I slowed down as I approached the town, unsure of whether I should stop. I wasn't looking for answers, but the thought of just being, of not being in a rush, felt like the right decision. So, I pulled into a small, run-down gas station, the kind of place you could tell hadn't seen any real action in years. I got out, stretching my legs as I looked around. The place was empty, save for an old man sitting on the porch, watching the world go by in silence. He didn't seem interested in talking, and I didn't feel the need to strike up a conversation. It was just a moment, one of many that seemed to blur together. The gas station attendant came out, a young woman with short, spiky hair, and gave me a quick nod. "Need anything?" she asked, her voice light but with an edge of curiosity. I shook my head. "Just filling up." As I stood there, pumping gas, I thought about Sarah again. Her face. The look in her eyes when she told me she had been seeing someone else. She hadn't even seemed sorry. Just indifferent. She hadn't cared that she had shattered everything between us. It was as if I was nothing more than an obstacle to her happiness. My chest tightened again, but I forced myself to push the thought away. I wasn't going to let her hold this power over me anymore. I finished filling the tank, paid for the gas, and then walked back to my car. The sound of the door slamming shut seemed final, almost as if it were the closing of a chapter. The open road lay before me again. And this time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I turned the radio on as I drove, letting the music fill the silence. It wasn't the kind of music I usually listen to, but it didn't matter. It was something new. Something different. And that's exactly what I needed right now. As the song played on, I thought about what the man in the diner had said to me, about moving forward. His words kept ringing in my ears. "It gets worse before it gets better," he had said. "But don't let it eat you alive." Maybe he was right. Maybe the worst was still ahead of me. But I was starting to understand that, for once, I didn't have to be in control of everything. Sometimes, the road ahead didn't need to be planned. Sometimes, the best thing to do was just keep moving, one foot in front of the other, and see where it led. It wasn't about fixing everything. It wasn't about repairing what had been broken. It was about finding a way to stand tall, despite the cracks. I passed a sign welcoming me to another small town. It was nothing extraordinary, just another place on the map. But it was mine, for now. It was a place where I could take a breath and stop pretending. I turned off the highway and into a small cafe parking lot, deciding to stop for a while. I wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but for once, I wasn't questioning myself. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the world settle into a manageable ache in my chest. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But I was okay with it now. I wasn't sure what the future held or what the rest of the journey would look like. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to have all the answers. I could just be. The cafe door swung open, and the bell above it jingled as I stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately, something comforting in the air that felt like a small refuge from the cold chaos of the past few days. A low murmur of voices filled the space, but it wasn't overwhelming. The hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, it was all strangely peaceful. I walked up to the counter, my footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. The barista, a young woman with dark hair and tired eyes, looked up at me with a quick smile. There was an understanding in her expression, as if she saw something in my eyes that no one else had noticed yet. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost like she wasn't expecting an answer. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the menu on the wall behind her. I wasn't really looking for coffee or anything to drink. I was looking for something else. A moment to just breathe. A break from my own mind. Just a black coffee, I said, my voice a little rougher than I'd intended. It didn't matter. She nodded, her fingers moving swiftly to prepare my drink. I felt my gaze drift across the room, to the worn wooden tables, to the small group of people sitting at the corner booth, laughing and talking like their lives weren't unraveling in the same way mine was. How easy it must be to just live, to not carry the weight of broken trust or fractured relationships. How easy it must be to forget about everything and focus on the present, on the little moments. But I wasn't there yet. And I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The barista handed me the coffee with a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. I nodded in thanks and moved to a table by the window, where I could watch the world outside. I took a sip of the coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through me. It wasn't a magical fix. It wasn't going to change anything. But for a moment, it was enough. I stared out at the street, at the people going about their business, at the cars driving by without a care in the world. It was like watching a movie. A life that wasn't mine, that I couldn't even fathom anymore. How was it possible to just move forward after everything had fallen apart? I thought about Sarah again. The way she had looked at me when I confronted her. Cold. Detached. The words she had thrown at me with such ease, like they were nothing. I don't love you anymore. I haven't for a long time. I didn't understand it. I still couldn't understand how everything had crumbled so quickly. How had I missed it? How had I let her get so far from me, from us, that when it all came to light, I didn't even recognize her anymore? I set the coffee down, my hands trembling slightly. I clenched my fist around the ceramic mug, trying to contain the storm inside me. I wasn't going to break again. Not now. Maybe I had spent too long wondering why. Too long searching for answers. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was ugly and raw, and no amount of questions would make it easier to swallow. I wasn't going to find the answers I needed. I wasn't going to understand why she'd done what she had. The betrayal ran so deep, it felt like it had cracked me open. I had already spent enough time being angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. For not recognizing the signs. For not realizing that she had stopped loving me long before I even suspected. The guilt had been all-consuming at first. It felt like I had failed her. Like I had failed us. But now, sitting there in that cafe, something inside of me shifted. I wasn't going to keep blaming myself. I wasn't going to keep punishing myself for things that were beyond my control. I had to let it go. The pain wasn't going to disappear overnight, and I wasn't going to pretend that I could simply move on. But I could choose not to let it define me. I could choose to walk away from it, step by step. And that decision, it felt like the first real one I had made in a long time. The door opened again, and a woman stepped in, her presence filling the room. She was tall, with dark hair tied back in a messy bun, and she had the kind of energy that made everyone in the room notice. She didn't look at anyone in particular, but her eyes seemed to sweep over everything, taking in the world around her as though she owned it. She was confident in the way she walked, in the way she carried herself. Her gaze fell on me for a brief moment, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside of me. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a brief moment of recognition, of connection. She walked to the counter, ordered something quickly, and sat at the table across the room, pulling out her phone and typing something. I found myself watching her, not because she was beautiful or captivating, though she was, but because, for a moment, I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in myself in a long time: control. It was the way she sat there, focused on what she was doing, not looking for validation from anyone. She was doing what she wanted, and she was completely unbothered by anything else. And suddenly, I wanted that. I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to fix what had broken. But I could be that person. I could take control again. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and left the cafe without a word. The cool air hit me as I stepped outside, the sunlight bright but not overwhelming. The world was still spinning. Life was still moving. And I was still here. It wasn't going to be easy. And I wasn't going to pretend it was. But I knew, in that moment, that I could handle whatever came next. Because I wasn't waiting for life to give me answers anymore. I was taking them. And for the first time, I felt like I had a chance. I stood there for a long moment, the cold wind brushing against my face, carrying with it the scent of change. The noise of the city faded, leaving only the quiet thrum of my own heartbeat. I looked at the horizon, the same horizon I had been running from for so long. But now, as I stood there in the stillness, I realized something: I was finally free. The weight I had carried for so long, the anger, the confusion, the heartache, it was all still there, yes, but it no longer defined me. It no longer had control over me. Sarah's betrayal, the pain of her indifference, the moments where I had been nothing but a ghost in my own marriage, those things no longer mattered. They didn't own me. It was almost laughable, in a way. All those months spent questioning myself, wondering where I had gone wrong. The anger I had directed inward, like I had been the one who deserved the blame. But now, I understood that the blame had never been mine to carry. The way Sarah had treated me, the way she had broken everything between us, was her choice. Not mine. And for once, that realization didn't hurt. It didn't tear me apart. It freed me. I walked, slowly, down the street, no real destination in mind. It didn't matter where I went. I was no longer concerned with where I was headed. The journey, it seemed, had always been more important than the destination. I had spent too much of my life trying to force everything into neat little boxes, into a plan, into an idea of what things should be. But now, I was stepping into the unknown. And that felt liberating. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling absent-mindedly, my thumb moving across the screen as I watched people's lives unfold in real time. Their successes, their failures, their mundane moments. It was all so trivial compared to what I had just been through. But then something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed. A message. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't open it. I'm sorry. It was simple. Almost too simple. But something in those two words hit me harder than anything I had expected. Sarah. She had reached out. Her apology, after everything, after months of silence. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. The pain I thought I had buried surged forward. But this time, I didn't react. I didn't feel the gut-wrenching need to respond or lash out. I simply stopped. She was sorry. But I wasn't. I wasn't sorry for leaving. I wasn't sorry for stepping away from the toxic hold she had on me. I wasn't sorry for wanting to rebuild my life, for deciding that my happiness mattered more than the scraps she had left behind. I pressed the button to delete the message. For the first time, I felt in control. I walked on, the streets now feeling like they were mine, like I was walking on my own path, free from the shadow of the past. The world was vast, and I was small, but the difference was that now, I knew I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself. The future didn't feel scary anymore. It felt wide open. I could fill it with whatever I chose. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from relief, or from a sense of closure, or from any kind of grand epiphany. It was just the smile of someone who had finally found peace within themselves. I had learned that sometimes, the hardest part wasn't letting go of the past. It was learning to forgive yourself. As I continued walking, the weight of years of pain began to lift, piece by piece. I didn't know what came next, but I knew this: whatever it was, I was ready. Because now, I was living for me. And that was all I needed.